Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me. More importantly, thank all of you for coming out for what I hope is a very interesting conversation. So Proposition HH, sorry, is that echoey to anybody or just up here? Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you all for coming out for a conversation on Proposition HH. I'm really looking forward to it. It is probably one of the bigger ballot initiatives that we will all be deciding this November. So it has a lot of different moving pieces to it, but the bottom line is it's going to affect state fiscal policy for the next decade or so. So, you know, not a big deal kind of thing. Anyways, so Proposition HH kind of fundamentally goes after property rates and property assessment So our story begins in 1939 with the birth of Dennis J. Gallagher, which is a joke. It doesn't actually go that far back, but it does this does kind of reflect back on the Gallagher Amendment. So anyways, just to kind of hop into a very broad overview of what the proposition would do, this is per the blue book that we will all be getting before we vote. And I will leave it to our fine panelists and lawmakers to kind of go more in detail based on like what they think is the salient points and questions that you all may have at the very back, at the end of the program. So, if passed, like I said, Proposition HH does a lot. Here are some of kind of the top line parts that it'll do. For one, it will lower the assessment rate and increase the deductions for non-residential and residential properties. How much that will affect individual property owners, that's something that, well, yeah, it depends on your individual circumstance. On top of that, it caps local property tax revenue. It creates a portable senior homestead exemption, and it pays for the loss in local revenue by raising the TABOR cap by 1 percentage point per year, compounding. And so per the blue book, that starts off with, it would increase the state budget by about $170 million for the next budget year, and then at the end of the 2031-32 fiscal year, that increases all the way up to about $2.2 billion. And then on top of that, Proposition HH, if it passed, it would also include increased funding for rental assistance and education funding, and it would change TABOR rebates for 1 year. And kind of the easy way in my brain that I think about it is if you make $99,000 a year or less, you'd get a little bit more on your TABOR rebate. If you are making more than $99,000 a year, you will get less of a TABOR rebate because it flattens it out, makes it equal for everybody in the state. So, anyways, as far as with your individual, how much this will affect you as an individual, the state legislative council staff has actually put together a really nifty calculator. There's a QR code for that is available in the blue book. I've heard some different criticisms and compliments of it, but at the end of the day, it does give a dollar amount that I encourage everybody who's trying to weigh this and trying to figure out, okay, does this work for me? Does this work for the community? Is this the direction I want the state to go in? It's just another really interesting data point. Like I said, that's in a QR code that's in your blue book that you will eventually get. I would have handed it out, but I'm really bad at drawing QR codes, unfortunately. So, on top of that, I wanted to go over a couple of stats just so that we all kind of have a baseline of like where we're at and what this issue, Proposition HH, is trying to solve. So, for one, throughout the state, this is according to a Redfin study. So statewide, the median home sales price in August 2018 was $400,000. In August 2023, so last month, the median sale price in the home in the state of Colorado was sold for $600,000. So a nice 50% increase. Of course, this data point is just for homes that were sold on the market, maybe doesn't apply to all the individual assessed property rates, et cetera. But it is an interesting data point in terms of how much that has meant for all the homeowners in the state and what kind of property tax they can be facing. In the recent property assessment cycle, we saw that in Denver County, there was an average of a 33% increase in home value, which then corresponds to people's property taxes and what they owe. In Douglas County, that was all the way to 47% increase on average for property valuations, and again, corresponding property taxes that people may owe. And then there's also the affordable housing aspect that we all know, having lived in Colorado, that affordable housing is constantly an issue across the state, making sure that people aren't home poor. And so a recent study by the state, it found that just to meet the need for current Colorado residents, so the folks who live in the state now, we as a state need to build 225,000 housing units in order to make the supply side of the supply and demand equation work and like not price everybody out. If you account for all the folks that the state expects to move to Colorado in the next few years, that needs to increase by another 100,000 housing units that need to be built across the state. So 325 housing units need to be built in the next several years in order to meet projected demand for housing and help ease some of those demand pressures that folks might be feeling. So much of this does track back down to the Gallagher Amendment, hence that bad joke that I started off the presentation with. And so I don't want to relitigate a lot of that because the state made its decision back in 2020 that they wanted to repeal Gallagher. And of course, that was the amendment that locked in the ratio between residential property and commercial properties. And proponents would argue that, yeah, that was credited with saving taxpayers some $35 billion over the years in property taxes over the, over 30 years. But opponents would argue that, yeah, that ended up also hamstringing local government and funding for local needs, while also saddling commercial properties with an undue burden because they had to carry a heavier load of the property tax burden. So all of that, coupled with the massive increase in property valuations through the state of people wanting to move to Colorado, or in my case, move back, that led to a sticker shock for a lot of folks when they got their assessment rates last summer and what that might mean for them, how much property taxes they owe. So Proposition HH was something that came out of the legislature in kind of the waning weeks. There was something that folks had been discussing kind of behind closed doors before that, and something that they hope will help alleviate some of the burden. Maybe some of the lawmakers want to go this far. I don't feel comfortable just being a workaday journalist, but that this will be maybe not a replacement for Gallagher, but something that kind of fills some of the void that it going away led to, especially in terms of trying to keep Colorado property tax valuations low. So, kind of the basic point that we're seeing with Proposition HH, and I can't wait to hear our panelists and our lawmakers kind of get more into the nitty-gritty and for you all to ask what I hope is some rabble-rousing questions to get really good answers from them later on in the program. The basic point is that a vote yes for Proposition HH is aimed at blunting the sharpest increase of property taxes and rent increases. It's important to note that I haven't heard any proponents arguing that it will lower property taxes and make people pay less. It won't necessarily lower the rent that people pay, but it will blunt what could be the sharpest increase that folks could be paying this property tax cycle, and it could prevent some of those property tax increases from being directly passed on to renters. However, if you vote yes for Proposition HH, that also comes at the cost of changing fundamentally the state's funding formula, which could have a long-term impact on how much of your tax dollars are kept by the state, how much money you get back potentially in future TABOR rebate years if they happen. And also there's been a concern from local governments that, yeah, they're going to be collecting less property tax revenue, and so what does that mean for them? Is the state's revenue collection, is that going to be able to backfill their needs for things like health and human services, restaurant inspections, et cetera? And there's also the education piece, which I have not touched on, and many folks say probably I neglected to, because that is a very important part of this. But our first panelist is a proponent. He is from the Poudre School District Education Association, John Robinson. He will be hopefully talking a lot more about what this education gap will be filling. So anyways, I figured to go ahead and get right into it and introduce our panelists. So while we get that all set up, I will do a more formal introduction of our panelists. So first up will be John Robinson. He is the president of the Poudre Education Association. Mr. Robinson, he served as a member of the Poudre Education Association Executive Committee for 12 years before elevating to the vice presidency in 2019. In 2020, he was elected to the president of the association, and before that, he was a high school history teacher in the Poudre School District for 24 years. So And then seated already is Kristi Burton Brown. She is a constitutional attorney and the immediate past chair of the Coloradoan Republican Party, where she was not only the first woman to hold that position in 40 years, but she was the youngest party chair in state history. Among other community engagement, she also tutors 4th and 6th graders in grammar and writing. She is leading the No on Prop H campaign, working with Advance Colorado, and Mr. John Robinson, he is working with the Yes on HH proposition on behalf of Poudre School District. So, anyways, I will just hand over the microphone to these fine folks.
Thank you very much, Nick. Would you like me at the dais, or
whatever you're more comfortable.
Sure. As Nick had said, I am a high school civics teacher here in Poudre School District. I am a parent of Poudre School District children, and I've been a community member for 30 years. I initially came out here to go to CSU, and I will quietly be cheering them on tomorrow night. Thank you. But in any event, as a public school teacher, I see the impact that HH can definitely have on some of our civic responsibilities and some of our utilities. And so it's a property tax relief that doesn't hurt. It's there for our libraries, for our fire districts, for our water districts, for our hospitals, and most importantly, my area of expertise, schools, which I'll be focusing on education today in this discussion. As Nick said, we'll go all the way back to 1937 with Dennis Gallagher. That joke still didn't land. And it's funny because I actually had Danny Gallagher, his son, in my class my first year as an educator. But as we look at this timeline real quick, I'll move us right up to the Gallagher Amendment being repealed through the referred ballot measure in 2020. 2021, we have the legislature passing temporary property taxes, tax relief, which is slated to dissolve. We have a Prop 13-like growth cap that has been proposed as a flat tax. The legislature extends in 2022 the temporary tax relief for 2 more years. And then finally, where we're at right now, where we have HH proposed and we have a continued Prop 13-like ballot measure that could be introduced. So real quick, what we're saying, as Nick had alluded to, shall the state cut property taxes and backfill important services that property taxes pay for in the TABOR surplus? As a homeowner in this community in Fort Collins, I've seen my own property taxes skyrocket. And I do support making sure that we have those public utilities like public schools. And so HH very much interested me a couple of months ago when we had some folks come and join us at the Colorado Education Association to talk about it. And some of the big things that I just want to highlight is that it reduces property taxes for all. As we've seen across the state, property taxes have been in contention. They're wildly increasing, and it would be nice to have something that works within the parameters to make sure that we do have our public utilities, but not at the expense of being able to afford owning a home in Fort Collins. And so we look at residential going down from 7.2% to 6.7%, and commercial being dropped from 29% to 25.9%. And we're looking at a $50,000 deduction for homeowners in the first year. Most importantly for me, I like looking at what it's going to do with that portability for the homestead the homestead exemption. In the neighborhood I live in, behind Blevins Middle School, our community is aged out for our schools, and it is priced out for our schools. I have several seniors that live around my specific house that my sons mow their lawns and shovel their snow, and they're really concerned about moving and losing that homestead exemption. HH would look to make that portable so these folks can look at the demographics of our community schools and be able to downsize to something that they would like to live in, and leaving the homes in our current neighborhood where I live up for young families to come in and be able to have their children thrive in the Poudre School District. And then finally, we're looking at cap future tax increases. And so as we look at inflation, as we look at exceeding the rate of inflation, we're going to reduce the tax rates and retain any surplus revenue to conduct a public process to do so. So on the savings for homeowners, we're looking at an average savings of $1,078 over the next 2 years, 23 and 24, and then $3,241 over the next 5 years. Just to kind of break that down for you on homeowner savings, I am in the bracket of about a $500,000 home. That's going to save $864 for me in my community. And like I mentioned on that savings for seniors, if seniors have already lost their homestead exemption, they would be able to recoup that, and the portability, which is important for me and important for our schools. So the average senior homeowner will save $1,065 over the next 2 years, and a senior who previously lost their senior homestead exemption because they move here will save $2,122. As Nick said, we're looking at savings for renters, and again, as a public school teacher, this is crucial for our teaching staff. When we're looking at living in our community, and I was fortunate enough to be able to purchase a home within walking distance of the school that I worked at. It's important that my students see me. In fact, former student here today, Abdul Aziz, working on the cameras. But to go into the Safeway right by my house and see my students at their after-school job, to grab a sandwich at Subway and see my students there and talk with them and be part of the community, I think is essential for our educators. And currently, our early career educators are renters. And it's unfortunate that as we increase property taxes, the potential for that to be passed on directly from the landlord to the renter is skewing the amount of money that they have to be able to purchase a home and live in our community. And then for businesses, as we look at reducing the non-RAR, as I mentioned earlier, from 29 to 25.9%, we're able to see revitalization of our Old Town areas. I'm thinking Old Town in Fort Collins, Old Town in Loveland, and in Greeley, and be able to have local businesses, small businesses, be able to thrive in our communities. And then most importantly, talking about what about the schools? And so what we're looking is using this backfill and taking 1% of the TABOR backfill and sending that to public schools. If I can remind you, we have an Amendment 23 already on our Constitution that is set to help fund our public schools. And unfortunately, since the budget stabilization factor, we haven't been able to make that commitment to public schools in at least 13 years. I'm thinking of my own son, who's a senior this year at Rocky Mountain High School, and he has yet to be in a fully funded public school his entire career, 13 years. And so this would be able to get a way to get that money to our schools. Most importantly, again, with our schools, the TABOR refund is an exception, not a rule. We've lived in a couple of years now of increased growth in our state, and I think that it's time that we use some of that increased growth in lowered property taxes and the TABOR surplus to take care of some of those fiscal obligations. Just looking in our community right now, we have buildings, elementary schools that are not prepared for climate change. In fact, this week coming up, I'm going to have to work with our calendar committee and see what we can do with the school calendar to make sure that our schools are adequate for our students to learn. And so this would offer an opportunity, instead of each local community having to rely on a bond to go out just for their community and their community schools, to actually make that promise and take our schools into the 21st century. So we're looking at HH allowing the state revenue to grow by 1%, simply 1%. And looking at this chart here, it shows you where that would be over the next couple of fiscal years for the decade. So under the HH, the majority of the people will get an increase to their TABOR refund, as Nick had mentioned slightly earlier. If you are in the $99,000 area there, you'll see an increase to your TABOR refund. If you are in the six-figure area, you'd have definitely a decrease in that area. And so right now what we're facing is two choices to replace Gallagher, as was mentioned. This one is a responsible tax relief that provides $1 to $1.6 billion in savings every year for businesses, homeowners, seniors, and renters to actually fund projects and grow funding for local critical services like our schools, fire departments, and libraries. Initiative 50 currently is a policy in California that has not worked under Prop 13. It would limit overall growth to fund local services like schools, fire departments, and libraries, but would all but solidify Colorado's position as one of the lowest in the nation for funding public education. And some of the folks endorsing this right now are Governor Jared Polis, former Governor Bill Ritter, the Colorado Education Association, the Poudre Education Association, Colorado Concern, Democrats for Education Reform, Bell Policy Center, Great Ed Colorado, all of the folks that are looking at taking care of our children and our future through public schools. That's about all I have. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. And again, now I'm going to turn it over for Ms. Kristi Burton Brown, the Senior Policy Analyst for Advanced Colorado. And I would just like also to remind everybody that we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So yeah, get all those burning things written down, and yeah, I look forward to the grilling. But anyways, Ms. Kristi Burton Brown.
All right, well, good morning. So good to be here with you all. There are two things that Colorado voters do not like. First of all, they do not like tax hikes. And second, they do not like being lied to. Proposition HH does both of these things. And I'm going to talk about 5 different areas in Proposition HH that I think will show you exactly how Prop HH is a tax hike, not a tax cut, and that it is lying to voters in a number of very unfair ways. So the 5 things I'm going to cover with you are education. We all care about our kids. We care about education. We want teachers to be paid more, but we want the money to go in the classrooms. So we'll talk about education. Secondly, we'll talk about seniors and how Prop HH is actually something that's being used to take advantage of seniors, not help them. Third, we're going to talk about property taxes. And you all are familiar with Rahm Emanuel, right? Former mayor of Chicago, known for corruption. One of his most famous statements is that you should never let a serious crisis go to waste. That's precisely what Proposition HH is doing. It's taking the crisis of property taxes in our state and not letting it go to waste. We'll get into the details in just a little bit. Fourth, I want to talk about TABOR, because that is the key and the core foundation of what Proposition HH is. It is an attack on TABOR, our Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which a very recent statewide poll just showed is popular with 70% of Coloradans. 70% of Coloradans want to keep their TABOR refunds. Did you all get the $750 check last year? In an election year, it was called the Colorado Cash Back. But we know that what it actually was is our TABOR refunds, that state law and our Constitution requires the government to give back to us when they collect more money than they're allowed to keep. And then fifth, I want to talk about renters. Renters make up 33% of Colorado's population. It is a key constituency in Colorado, and Proposition HH hurts renters almost more than anyone else. The Common Sense Institute, which is a nonpartisan group that studies, does research across the state on a number of issues like crime, homelessness, and economic issues, actually came out with a report saying that renters are the biggest losers under Proposition HH, and we'll talk about why. So when we first dive into Proposition HH, the ballot language really matters. And when I say that Proposition HH lies to voters, I'm specifically talking about the ballot language. It starts out, if you read it, just by saying, shall property taxes be reduced? Well, if you got your assessment bill in the mail, who doesn't want our property taxes to be reduced? Everyone does. Senior citizens are coming into the county commissioner's offices in my county and saying they're afraid they can't even keep their homes anymore because of the giant hike in property taxes in Colorado. This is a real issue. But it's a deception for the ballot language on Prop HH to pretend that it solves that issue at all. Secondly, if you go further down in the ballot language for Prop HH, it talks about paying for all of this by using state surplus. I don't know about you, but when I hear the word surplus, and when the average voter hears the word surplus, they think of something extra, something that already belongs to the state. State surplus should be something that's already in the state's box, something they get to keep. That's not really accurate. Our TABOR refunds, which is actually what they're referring to, don't belong to the government. When the citizens of Colorado put TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, we decided that we wanted to cap spending in Colorado. We wanted our government to be responsible in their amount of spending, and if they collected more than we said they could keep, they have to give it back to us in refunds. That's not optional. It's a rule in Colorado. It's part of our Constitution. So to pretend that this is being paid for by money that the state already gets to keep in a surplus is a deception. And it's not letting voters know that it's really asking them to pay for it with their TABOR refunds. We've all heard of robbing Peter to pay Paul. This is literally robbing Peter to pay Peter. The state is pretending that they will give you a reduction in your property taxes while out of your back pocket it asks for your TABOR refunds and asks you to pay more than they're actually giving you back in any sort of property tax decrease. So other than the deception in the ballot language, let's dive into the real issues involved in Prop HH. First of all, education. There are a lot of people going around saying we need Prop HH because we need to increase spending on education. Actually, one of the few bipartisan things in Colorado that people do agree with in the legislature is that we do want to see more money in the classrooms for our kids. But even without Prop HH passing, education dollars statewide in Colorado are already going to be increased by at least 10%, because we're required to raise it by inflation, and Governor Polis has already promised to eat away and actually completely get rid of the budget stabilization factor next year. So we already know that education dollars are going to be increased. Our schools will already see an increase of money. One of the biggest problems in education funding in Colorado is that only 55% of the dollars get into the classrooms. Administrators, bureaucracy, the adults involved in the system are getting the money, but it's not going to our kids. And if you look at the numbers with math and reading and test scores among our kids, it's clear that we need more money in the classrooms. We need to pay teachers more. We need to get results for our kids. But just increasing the money isn't the only way to do it. So it's a false equivalency. And also, if Proposition HH really is an ask for you and all the voters in Colorado to use your TABOR refunds to give more dollars to education, why isn't that what the ballot language says? Why aren't they being honest about it? If the whole reason behind Prop HH is to fund education at a higher level, it should not be pitched as a property tax decrease. They should be honest with you and say, we're trying to ask for your TABOR refunds to pay for education. Let the voters decide, but tell them what you're asking for, instead of disguising it as a property tax decrease and using a crisis and preying upon people who are truly very afraid that they are going to lose their home, telling them this is a break in their property taxes when what you really want is more money for education. And the state's done this before, asked for more money for education. They did that with Prop CC in 2019, which got defeated by 8 points. But they did ask for more money for education. They made the case, voters said no. If that's what you want, make the case again. But don't pretend this is something that it's not. Secondly, when we talk about seniors, it's true that Proposition HH would make the homestead exemption for seniors portable. But here's the other piece of truth to that. The legislature did not need to put portability of the senior exemption on the ballot. They could have passed that during the session. And in fact, Bills have been run year after year trying to make that exemption portable, trying to increase that exemption. And it absolutely should be increased. It should be doubled or tripled for seniors, not the small increase in exemption that Prop HH is attempting to make. Back when the senior exemption was put into law, $100,000 was a big amount for a house in Colorado. It's not anymore. The senior exemption should absolutely be increased, and it should be made portable. We don't need HH to do it. The legislature could have done that all on their own. They can do it next session. The governor can call a special session and do it now. Instead, by hiding that inside the details of Proposition HH, they are attempting to buy the vote of seniors. And at the same time, they're taking away a TABOR refund from seniors, so actually taking more money from them than they would be giving. Third, if we look at property taxes itself, when we talk about what the legislature could have done during the session, we also know that it was fully within the legislature's ability and power to cut or cap property taxes during the session. Governor Polis, if that's what he cares about, could also call a special session if they just didn't get to it, to cut or cap our property taxes now. They don't need to ask us. They don't need to go to the ballot to cut or cap our property taxes. The one and only reason we're being asked to vote on Proposition HH is because it is a taking of our TABOR refunds. If it wasn't, if all it is was a property tax cut or cap, they could have taken care of it themselves during the session. I think that's a really, really important key to understand, because many of us know that a big goal of some of the people in the legislature and the governor's office for years has been to take away TABOR, to take away our taxpayers' Bill of Rights, that refund that we get every year. And so they took the property tax crisis and said, this is our pathway to taking your TABOR refunds. Projections by nonpartisan fiscal analysts show that our TABOR refund would be permanently eliminated by 2027. That's the current projection. So yes, the Yes on HH campaign will tell you that next year, if you pass HH, your TABOR refund will be increased. It'll be higher than the $750 check you got last year for most Coloradans. Well, that's true for 1 year. But again, another attempt to buy your vote, when the real story is that by 2027, you'll never get another TABOR refund again. Because Prop HH, it's not just a simple 1% that the state gets to spend. It is a compounding 1%. That is a vital key for people to understand with Proposition HH. They're not just asking for, oh, give us 1 more % that we get to keep in your taxes. No, give us another %, and then the next year compound that with another 1%, and then the next year compound it with another 1% for 10 years. To the degree that the state will get $10 billion in 10 years. Again, that's not a projection from my group, Advanced Colorado. That is a projection from nonpartisan fiscal analysts at the legislature. And in addition, Proposition HH doesn't just stop after 10 years. When the 10 years are up, it gives the state legislature the option to vote without going to the people, without asking anything of the people. The legislature, all on their own, can extend Proposition HH for another 10 years, which would give the state a total of $21 billion more in revenue than they currently are allowed to spend. And by the way, every penny of that $10 billion in revenue for the 10 years and $21 billion in 20 years should be in our pockets. Those are TABOR refunds that Proposition HH is asking us to permanently turn over to the state. And in exchange for what? They say it's in exchange for property tax decrease. What they're actually doing is taking the property tax rate for residential houses from 6.76 to 6.7%, 0.06% decrease. Our property taxes across the state are still going to be increasing by, on average, 31%. I don't remember the last time a significant increase in taxes was called a tax cut. Sure, you might be paying a tiny bit less than you'd otherwise pay, but you will still be paying the largest property tax increase in Colorado history, and it didn't have to be this way. The state legislature had it entirely within their authority to do a real cut or a real cap on property taxes and give seniors and low-income Coloradans and 33% of renters across the state and every people group you can think of a real break on their taxes and make Colorado actually an affordable place to live. Instead, Proposition HH will just continue to make Colorado very unaffordable for young families like my family and so many people that we all know. TABOR, I've already covered, but I think it's really, really important to know that this is the biggest point behind Proposition HH. It is an attack on our Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It will take away our refunds, the $750 check that so many people needed for their families last year. You're not going to get it anymore once we hit 2027. All that money is going to go to the state. They get to do what they want with it. And they can continue to extend it into the future with that compounding 1%. 70% of Coloradans love TABOR. 70% of Coloradans want that refund check because we do know how to spend our money better than the government does. And we'd love to see more of it in our pockets instead of just handing it up to the Capitol in Denver with whatever their projects are. We know what our family needs. And that's why 70% of Coloradans want that refund. It's why you see the opposition to HH is bipartisan. The support for HH is not bipartisan, but the opposition is. And that's because if 70% of Coloradans support something, that's a great group of Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliateds. Colorado is known for wanting low taxes. We are known for wanting government to have less say over our lives, not more say. And Proposition HH would give government more ability to reach into our pockets, more ability to decide what to do with the money that really should be ours. Last of all, I want to cover renters, because they're a big piece of this puzzle when we talk about Proposition HH. 33% of Coloradans are renters. And at the last minute, when Proposition HH was created in the legislature, they threw in a renters fund for $20 million that would go to renters if Proposition HH passes. A couple important things on that. The $20 million fund actually comes last. So everything else has to be funded in Proposition HH. It definitely was sort of a Hail Mary pass to get some Democrats on the side of Proposition HH to pass it. But the money is absolutely not guaranteed to go to renters at all. Plus, if you think about 20 million divided up between 33% of Coloradans who are renters, it's not significant at all, even if it is covered. But the biggest key is that it is not accurate to say that renters are going to get a decrease in their rent if Proposition HH passes, and the homeowners are getting a very slight property tax decrease. Again, even with a very slight 0.06% of a property tax decrease, property taxes are still going up by over 30% statewide. That would equal an increase in the rent that renters are going to pay every month to cover that increase for landlords, because that's what always happens. And in addition to that, renters get TABOR refunds. Renters across Colorado got those $750 checks last year. They won't get those anymore if Proposition HH passes. There's a website you can go to, mypropertytaxco.com. Again, that's mypropertytaxco.com. You can enter your address. You can see how much money you would save under Proposition HH, how much money you would save if Initiative 50, which will be on the 2024 ballot, it's a 4% cap. If that passes, how much you would save. But then what it also shows you is how much you would lose in TABOR refunds if Proposition HH passes. And what renters will see consistently is that they're getting zero from Proposition HH when we talk about property tax decrease. And they are losing, on average, $5,119 per household if Proposition HH passes. And that's why the Common Sense Institute, again, a nonpartisan research group in Colorado, determined that if Prop HH passes, renters are the biggest losers. Because their rent is going up every month because property taxes are going up by over 30% across the state. They're going to be paying that every month in rent. And then not only are they going to be doing that and not seeing property tax relief because they don't own property, they're also going to be stripped away from their TABOR refunds, which is something that if you talk to a lot of renters across the state, that $750 check meant a lot to them and their families last year. But Prop HH would take that away from them. So no matter which people group in Colorado you particularly care about or you work for, Proposition HH is bad for low-income Coloradans, it's bad for renters, it's bad for seniors, and it's taking advantage of so many groups to attempt to buy their votes. There are other ways to fund education in Colorado, and that's something that, in a bipartisan fashion, we want to do. So there are other ways to fund education, and there are other ways to give real solutions on property taxes. We should push the legislature to do it. We should ask the governor to call a special session. And we should vote no on Proposition HH in November because it doesn't do the things it promises to do, and it takes away our TABOR refunds. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Again, Kristi Burton Brown with Advanced Colorado, Senior Policy Analyst. And now we're going to call up all of our Northern Colorado lawmakers, and then we'll do some brief introductions of them, and we will turn over the microphone and go down the table. That's what that is. And go down the table and allow them to share their thoughts on Proposition HH and if it is what Colorado needs at this moment. And again, Q&A to follow their opening remarks. So yeah, get the fastballs ready, folks.
Are we going that way? Huh? Okay, great.
All right. So first off, we're going to start with Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer. Excuse me. She is a fourth-generation Colorado resident. Kirkmeyer is a resident of Weld County. She has served a total of 19 years as the Weld County Commissioner from 1993 to 2000, and again from 2009 to 2020. She was elected to the Senate in 2020 and was the Republican candidate for the newly created 8th Congressional District in 2022. She currently serves as the Minority Whip and a member of the Joint Select Committee on Rising Utility Rates, Appropriations, and on the Joint Budget Committee. All right, Senator, if you'd like to say a few words on Proposition HH.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this forum today. Greatly appreciate it so that we can get out the real facts with regard to Proposition HH. So, oh my gosh, did anyone but me see that slide up there that said Proposition HH for Dummies, Prop HH for Dummies? So it's true. The governor and my colleagues across the aisle believe that you're dumb and you can't understand HH. That they're going to pull one over on you. Because it's also true, we didn't need to go to the ballot to give property tax relief. We could have done this in the legislature. In fact, you saw on one of their other slides. We did it in 21, we did it in 22, we did it in 23 to give you property tax relief. We didn't need to go to the ballot. Just let that sink in. Because when I talk about this ballot measure, I talk about what the real title of this ballot measure should be. Instead of saying, are you willing to consider meaningful property tax relief? What this ballot measure should have really said was this. Are you willing to give up your TABOR refund check forever for temporarily 2 years of this itsy-bitsy, minuscule little property tax relief called a decrease in your increase? Because your property taxes are still going up. If HH passes, if HH doesn't pass, your property taxes are still going up. Sharp increase, at least by 31%. At least by 31%. This legislature didn't vote in last hour of the last day of session, real property tax relief. They voted in a bait and switch. They're trying to tell you you're going to get property tax relief. But what they really should be telling you is you need to give up your TABOR refund check for you to get property tax relief. You need to let state government grow by $10 billion over the next 10 years, and that's a conservative approach to it, conservative estimate by the Legislative Council Services, who's a nonpartisan staff for the legislature. So you're not getting property tax relief. Your property taxes are going up. State government is going to continue to grow by another $10 billion or more over the course of the next 10 years and can continue to grow. No more voter approval. We don't ever have to come back to you. They snuck that one in, so shh, it's a secret. They don't ever like to talk about it. They snuck that one in. It's like 3 words, 4 words, no voter approval necessary. We have to do some legislative enactment. They don't ever have to come back to you again. This Proposition HH will totally dismantle TABOR and take away your TABOR refund. And for that, in exchange, renters, you get nothing. You don't pay property taxes. 40% of Coloradoans are renters. Totally disrespected 40% of Coloradoans because they don't pay property taxes. Sure, I heard on the floor they said, oh, those landlords, they're going to pass along any property tax decrease. Well, I just told you, there is no property tax decrease. A decrease in the increase is not a property tax decrease. Even my 93-year-old friend, my neighbor, who has been in her property for over 60 years, wants to know why they think they can fool her. Is it just because she's older? That's what she asked me the other day. Because I'm older, they think they can fool me? Like, how am I supposed to get the portability? Why didn't they just give that to me anyways? Because we could have, and we tried. We had a state senator, Senator Liston from El Paso County, tried several years, I know of a fact, at least 3 years in a row, to make the senior exemption portable. To make it portable. But seriously, what they're still not saying to seniors is, to get this minuscule decrease in your increase, because there's still going to be an increase in property taxes, you got to give up your TABOR refund check. And my 93-year-old friend is like, what the heck? And I was like, exactly, that's what the legislature is doing. And you'll hear from the legislature that, gosh, we need your TABOR refund check so that we can fund education. Anytime a legislator says that to you, you ask them, when was the last time they voted to fully fund education and follow the Constitution? My Democrat colleagues for the last 13 years have not even adhered to the Constitution. They have been balancing the state's budget on the backs of students for 14 years. Do you believe them now? Seriously, do we believe them now when they say, gosh, we need that money for education? This is a statutory amendment. Do we believe them that they're going to spend it on education when for 13 years they have been not listening, not following the Constitution and fully funding education? I don't, and I'm down there. And here's the other thing. We have close to nearly $5 billion sitting in our coffers that could go to education, unrestricted reserves and fund balances. In our state education fund, in our permanent trust fund, and in our balances, in our reserves. We don't need your TABOR refund check. This is pretty simple. Let the legislature know that you're not dumb. You can figure this one out all on your own. You understand your property taxes are going up, and you're going to have to get rid of your TABOR refund check. Vote no on Proposition HH.
All right, thank you, Senator. And we will now turn to Senator Joanne Janal. She's a resident of Fort Collins, where she previously served as a House representative from 2012 through 2019, at which time she was chosen to fill the remaining term of then-Senator John Gaffalis upon his resignation. She was elected to a full term in 2020. She currently sits on the Health and Human Services, Business, Labor, and Technology, and Statutory Revision Committees. In her spare time, she is a reproductive, I'm going to mispronounce this, I apologize, Senator, a reproductive endocrinologist. So, Senator Janal.
Thanks, Nick. I just want to say, in my spare time, I'm really not a reproductive endocrinologist. I do some fun things. That was my background, and so thank you. That's what I did in a prior life. But do you mind if I sit down? Because I have a couple things I would like to make sure I don't miss. First of all, I want to thank Joe Rowan and the chambers, both the Fort Collins Chamber and the Loveland Chamber of Commerce, putting this on. it was really important that we have this very frank discussion about, to me, it's a number one issue that we're all here for, and that's Proposition HH. I'm in this discussion for a number of reasons. I feel, similar to my colleague here, Senator Kirkmeyer, that we aren't being told everything about this, what's in this bill. I feel that there is a lack of transparency. And I want the people of Colorado, my constituents, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, I want you to know the pros and the cons of this bill and what it does. I've tried to initiate with my colleagues here in northern Colorado, and most of them are Democrats like I am. And the ultimate concern for me was, yes, we would have a town hall, but it would only be for support. And I don't believe that's fair. I believe people need to have both sides of this issue discussed and understand both sides of this issue, and that's why we're here. I'm one of the few Democrats that oppose Proposition HH. And, you know, since I got into politics, and I'm a scientist, but when I got into politics, the very first thing I was told by the people who were teaching me about, God bless them, about sales tax and property taxes and mill levies, they told me that we've got to get rid of TABOR. TABOR's no good. And, you know, for a long time, I thought about that and I went along. But I see the advantages of how it helps people who need that check. When this bill, and this is the bill right here, 61 plus pages with amendments to it, was brought forth in the last few days of session, I listened to a couple of people I really respect. One of them is sitting to my left, and that is Senator Kirkmeyer. Senator Kirkmeyer, I believe the date on one of these things that were in the, what was that? It was one of the Colorado Politics or something. It was Senator Kirkmeyer at the podium, and she was going through this whole bill. It was 2 days before session was going to end. And that was the bill really didn't have much discussion. Usually we have, you know, it goes through a committee, it goes to appropriations, it comes up to the Senate floor, it's heard twice before it's voted on. And I was listening to her, and it was late one night. She went through every single page. And I can tell you one thing. I was one of the few senators on my side of the aisle that was even in my seat, even in the chamber, listening to this one. You can hear her on the Colorado TV channel. It's, I don't know, 160, 165. She explains it, every single thing in this bill perfectly. But my other colleagues were not there to listen to this. This is how I learned about this bill, because there were other bills coming fast and furious in the last 3 days. One of them was one of the biggest land use bills that this state has ever seen, and that was Senate Bill 213. I was trying to wrap my head around that. I was trying to wrap my head around passing other bills that I was sponsoring, and this just kind of got slipped in. Thinking, oh, it's a Democratic bill, just vote for it, it'll be fine. It's about TABOR, it's about getting rid of TABOR. Well, when I listened to her, and I also called my partner, Deb, who's sitting right here, who's an accountant, who I also respect in regards to her mathematical abilities, I asked her to just do some figuring about how this would work and if we would save money. And basically what we figured out for our house, which isn't any special house, I mean, we love it, but it's, you know, a middle house. it would save us $166 per year on property taxes. And compare that to, at the time this bill was getting passed, it was a $660 tax increase. It has gone up to $880 plus, and I think it's still growing. But between listening to Senator Kirkmeyer, and she wasn't doing anything but reading and explaining what was in this bill, and my partner Deb figuring out our property taxes, I'm like, why would we pass up the $880, and then it was $600, but we were only gonna save about, I don't know, $300. So we'd be better off getting the check. And I'm thinking of all the other people who, who need this money. It's their money, especially the seniors. The seniors are the ones who are hanging on by their fingernails on a fixed income. And what's sad to me is the fact that they can barely pay the utilities. Those are going up. They do have rents. Those are going up. And they can't even go out to have a pizza and see a movie. And that kind of breaks my heart. But I just wanted to say just a couple more things if I can. And share with you something. In the 1990s, I moved here to go to grad school. And I didn't know what TABOR was, but I got a check in the mail. And it was, I think, around $150. And that $150 helped my rent or my food, and I was a starving grad student at that time. I didn't know and realize in a couple of decades I'd be talking about this, but it really helped me as a student and as a renter. And as was mentioned, we all got $750 TABOR refunds, right? Did any of you save them, send them back? Did you spend them? I bet you did. One other thing I just want to mention is I talked to a few people, and it really bothered me that they thought that $750, they couldn't have read the letter, was another COVID check. And I'm like, no, that was your TABOR refund. You're just getting it a little bit early, but it's not another COVID check. It is what you are getting back and should be getting back for what you put in. And I just urge you, I have so much more to say, but I can see that Joe is like pointing at his watch. But I just want to say, I'm standing up for the people. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or unaffiliated. I don't care what you are. This is flawed. It can be fixed. Next session, I, along with Senator Liston, did the portability bill. And I can tell you right now, my own Democratic committee killed it. I think were they thinking of this or not? I don't know. But I just hope that people will realize there's more to this than a property tax decrease. It affects so many more people. I urge you and hope that you will, I want you to make up your own mind, but where I come from, it's about helping people. And right now, people need that check. Right now, it's $880 plus, and it's growing. And that would help so many working families and seniors and students and renters. And I thank you for letting me take up this time, and I really appreciate you all being here today.
All right, Senator, thank you very much. Up next, we have House Minority Leader Mike Lynch. He is a resident of Wellington, and he was first elected to the House in 2020 and reelected in 2022. He was chosen by his caucus to serve as Minority Leader that same year. He currently sits on the Executive Committee of the Legislative Council and Joint Select Leadership on Rising Utility Rates. And previously, he worked in leadership positions in SHL Aspen Tree Software and the Stryker Corporation. All right, Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you. We'll make up time because I'll be short. I want to talk, we've heard all about the nuances of this bill, but I want to talk a little bit about where it came from and how this happened, and give you some inside scoop about what goes on down at the Capitol. Well, I can tell you that every year we go down there as conservative Republicans, we know that there's going to be some sort of attempt at trying to kill the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR. And in this session, we thought we were clear, and we had it taken care of, and then the last week comes along. So keep in mind, this is an issue that's been plaguing Colorado for a couple years. We've seen this coming. This is not anything that was a big surprise that at some point the citizens are going to open up that tax bill and go, oh my gosh, I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford to live in Colorado anymore. That got some people's attention, and it got the governor's attention, and he said, well, you know what, we probably ought to do something about this. And supposedly, this bill had been stakeholded. So for those of you that don't speak legislative speak, stakeholding is where they go out and ask the community about what they're doing down at the legislature and get your input. So I have a question for this audience. Anybody who was involved in, because I would expect this group here that is passionate enough to spend a Friday morning coming out here, you probably would have been involved enough in your community to be asked about what went into Senate Bill 303. So if those who were part of that stakeholding, if you could raise your hand, I would like to know who you are in the room. Nobody. And that is a problem. So this is a major piece of legislation that the governor's office created. I will tell you, from the well of the House of Representatives, they said this bill has been stakeholded more than 200 times. Immediately, I text my caucus and say, hey, tell me in your districts, in the 19 districts that the minority holds, how many times was this bill stakeholded that you know of? And the answer was 0. And none of you who, like I said, you wouldn't be here right now if you were not somehow vested in this process, and you were not asked about what should go into this major piece of legislation. So that is a problem in itself right there. Back to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It does more than just give you back some of your money every year. The effect it has down at the legislature is that it causes pause when people are writing legislation, spending your money on whatever it may be. It causes pause because it is a mechanism that they can't break that rule of impacting TABOR without thinking about it. I would say that is a much greater impact than the checks that we get back. If we destroy that pause, we will have unfettered spending of your money from the state capitol. So that's a part of TABOR that we don't talk about very often, is that in the process it makes us think about it a little bit. Another part of this bill that was concerning to me was every bill down at the House has to have 3 days of, I call it the gestation process, where it's got to be down there and alive for 3 days. Sure enough, with the Friday before the Monday before we get out, we have a bill, once again, not stakeholder. Matter of fact, this one didn't even go through committees. House Bill 1311 is a bill that normalizes the tax returns. Okay, so let me put that in perspective. That is, that if you, as a wealthy individual in the state of Colorado, gave the state capitol $100,000 of your money, tax money, you're going to get back, at the time, it's gone up now, at the time it was $611 back. If you were homeless but you had a mailbox and could file a return, you're going to get back $611. Well, that made no sense to me, because how is that fair? How is that fair that you are giving a bunch of money to the state, but you don't get a proportional amount of that back? So I could not figure out why we were running this bill literally within hours of when it would have been too late to put it on there. And the real reason is that gave, and oh, by the way, this does not go into effect unless you vote yes on HH. So do the math on that. Myself and Senator Kirkmeyer both ran amendments to this to say, hey, let's decouple this from HH. If this is not a bribe, if this is not an attempt for the governor to garner the votes of people that usually would not get anything back, what is it? And if it's such a great idea, why are we going to attach it to Prop HH? I ran that amendment. You ran that amendment. That was not the real intent of House Bill 1311, which came on literally within hours of when you could no longer put a bill forward. So the combination of that and the combination that everybody's talking about, where this really is not going to decrease anything, it's going to be lesser of an increase. I'm more concerned about the way this came about and the fact that not a single person in this room raised their hand and said, I had any input in this. We are not geniuses down there. This is the one job that you can have and have no job requirements. Just let that be very clear. To be in politics, you just need to get elected. We are not tax experts. We are not folks that know a lot about this. We rely on your input, and this proposition, Senate Bill 303, did not have any input that we can tell from anyone other than the smart folks in the governor's office that did not take the time and effort to go out and talk to you. So we can do better. We can do better if we take time and do this. One of the bills that one of my representatives proposed did that. It said, hey, let's pause. Let's figure this out. Let's actually talk to those 200 stakeholding folks and do it better. But because there was this big impetus that, oh my gosh, my tax bill just went up, the governor has to come in and fix this problem, is why we have a sloppy piece of legislation here that's led to very sloppy HH. So I would encourage, one thing that is very telling is definitely go to that mypropertytaxco.com. I did it actually for the first time this morning. And discovered my tax bill went up 103%. I don't know that I'm special, or maybe they targeted my address, but I think if people do that and they're honest with what this really does, I think we'll see common sense prevail at the ballot box in this. So I would really encourage you to not only vote no on it, but encourage others to do the same. Thank you.
All right. Minority Leader Mike Lynch, thank you very much, sir. All right, and so now we turn to State Representative Andrew Basenecker. He is a resident of Fort Collins, and he was first appointed to fill the seat vacated by Jenny Arndt in 2021. He was elected to a full term in 2022. He currently serves as Majority Co-Whip and a member of the Appropriations, State Civic, Military and Veterans Affairs, Transportation, Housing and Local Government, and Legislative Audit Committees. He is a past elementary school music teacher, and he is the founding pastor and director of Mustard Seed House Churches. All right, Representative.
Well, thank you, Nick, and certainly thank you to all the organizations and Joe for pulling this conversation together. I really do appreciate it. I think it's important to start with a couple pieces. I have a few items I want to hit here. First being process. Second, how we talk about renters and what renters do or don't want, or more importantly, what we deem to be good or bad for renters in our state. Third being older adults or seniors, as they've been referred to in this conversation. And fourth being business in our community. The first thing I wanted to mention briefly is process. And I have another website for you to write down that I think is important, and that is ledge.colorado.gov. That's ledge.colorado.gov. That is an important website to you because what you can do is unpack things that are said or claimed or articulated in relation to process about how bills work at the state legislature. If you go to that bill, or if you go to that website and you type in Senate Bill 303, you will see that this bill received hearings on the Senate Appropriations Committee, was on second reading and third reading in the Senate. Then it came to the House. It came to my committee, House Appropriations, where it received a hearing. We also approved funding for bills in appropriation. Then it was on second and third reading on the House. We amended the bill in the House, and it came back to the Senate for concurrence on those amendments and repassage. And I am especially proud to say, but I think it's important to note, that every Democrat on this panel voted for concurrence and repassage of Senate Bill 303. That is not to say that the conversation is over once a bill passes. However, it tells you what's going on in the moment with the process. After all the speeches were done, we push the button. And that is an important thing to note as well. In terms of process, we have 120 days to do legislative work. That's the constitutional limit. And I can tell you for myself, I intend to use every single minute of every single hour of every single day to do the people's business. Because the issues I hear about every day are kitchen table issues. I am worried that I can't afford to stay in my home. I don't know how to choose between groceries or prescriptions this month. I can no longer afford gas in my car. I'm wondering how I sleep in my car and also use my CPAP machine because I have sleep apnea and I've just been evicted. These are the pressing issues facing folks in our community, and I truly do believe that we intend to solve issues with every bit of integrity that each of us brings into that Capitol every day, no matter the letter behind our name. So I bristle at the notion that people are being lied to. I bristle at the notion that we are being untruthful. We see policy differently, but I believe at the end of the day, each and every person on this panel cares deeply about our communities, and that's why we are here. That is the work that voters expect us to do. Over 90% of the bills that pass through the state legislature pass with a bipartisan vote. It's the 10% that brings out sometimes the worst of our political environment. And so I'm thankful for this conversation to be able to focus on these moments of clarity and fact. And we can disagree, we can walk out of this room disagreeing just as we may have walked into it. That is fair and fine. But how we engage in that discussion really does matter. I will say this, renters. Renters received $750, and it looks like they'll receive an even larger refund this year. Those are the exceptions to the norm. Typically, if you know how TABOR works, you would know that that is an income-based refund for renters. So the assertion that they will be losing that same dollar amount year over year over year is simply inaccurate when it comes to the facts. I want to talk about another thing with renters, and that's mobile home park tenants. I was recently out at Sunflower Community, which is a mobile home park community in Senate District 23, House District 52. Those folks received a letter from the company that owns the land their home sits on, saying that because of the property tax increases, we will be passing this on directly to you as residents. Those are older adults. That is a 55-plus community. I was out there with our county commissioners, with our county treasurer. We listened. We heard from park management who said, we think this is a shame as well. There's nothing we can do about it. Conversations like that drive me to the table to figure out what we can do to lower the property taxes for folks. And if you look at businesses, it's a greater cut than even the individual resident or homeowner would receive, to be able to drive down deep affordability into communities like that to keep older adults housed in our communities. We know that the cost of rehousing an individual is immensely more detrimental than it would be to simply keep them in place in the first place. And that's why I think the $20 million that we will be directing towards a renters fund is critical. I also would encourage colleagues in the state legislature to listen to renters when they tell us what they need, and not use folks as a political prop. Gen X and millennials have higher renter rates than any other population group in our county, in our community, and across our state. And so if we are going to come to the table and tell a renter what is good for them, I believe it's on us to ensure that they're sitting right next to us when we do it. I would also say this. I'm a former K-5 elementary school music teacher in Florida, which funds educators better. John, I'm looking at you for validation. Yeah. Better than the state of Colorado. I worked 3 jobs when I was an educator. I worked during the day at a Title I school where 70% of my students were free and reduced. I washed beer glasses and brought beer up from the basement of a bar after that. And then I also did DJing on the weekends at some pool decks because I couldn't afford to do the thing I love to do, which is teach kids in our community. I have 3 students in the Poudre School District. I'm sure we all have children, grandchildren, aunts, or nieces, nephews, cousins, etc., that go to school here. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do right by them and not tap into our reserves, which quite frankly has been a fiscally responsible approach that we have taken as a state to ensure that, God forbid, another pandemic come along, we are prepared to react and respond accordingly without cutting vital services. For seniors, and I say this on behalf of folks like my parents, it's not just the portability piece, but it is also very much the portability piece as we look at affordable housing in our communities and the ability to downsize without losing your senior homestead tax exemption. Add to that from 2025 to 2032 that seniors will actually receive a boost in the amount of the homestead tax exemption to $140,000. Previous bills that have addressed policy in this space have failed to account for how we pay for it without cutting into vital services. And those are the realities of TABOR, that if we're going to make a tax cut, it's got to come from someplace. And I can tell you the one thing nobody wants to volunteer is their thing. So it's fiscal responsible policy to be able to do it inside of HH. I would have a couple other things to say. I think I'm at time, Joe. I want to be respectful of other people's time and just say, I am a proponent of HH, but by no means does that mean that the conversation is over or that it isn't my job and every person's job on this panel to hear from our community and enact better policy. Nobody has all of the good ideas, but that doesn't mean we can't support good ideas when we see them and work with our community to refine those policy pieces. So I thank you for your time.
All right, Representative, thank you very much. So up next, we have State Representative Kathy Kipp. She's also a resident of Fort Collins, where she served as a member of the Poudre School District Board of Education from 2011 to 2017. She was appointed to serve in the Colorado House of Representatives in 2019, replacing Joanne Janal, who you all may remember. And in Representative Kipp, she was elected to serve a full term in 2020 and re-elected last year. She currently serves on the Energy, Environment, and Finance committees. Her prior profession was in database management. All right, Representative Kipp, please.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who came today, and to Joe and the NCLA for putting on this forum. I think it is incredibly important to make sure that we're getting information about this HH out there to folks. And I do want to say, HH does not kill TABOR. HH does exactly what TABOR says we should do, and it says we should go out and ask the voters about what they think. And so really, in the end, this is all up to you, and I do believe that our voters are smart enough to understand that what this policy does is essentially it allows some reduction in what otherwise would be an even steeper increase in property taxes. It creates a way to pay for those things that might otherwise get cut if they were dealt with otherwise. For instance, on the senior homestead exemption, as has been mentioned previously, if we don't have a way to pay for it, then that just comes out of our very limited state budget, which we don't have the money to put into it. So I kind of, I think when you say it's a TABOR surplus, that is not an accurate statement. You can say it's a TABOR surplus. It is the amount over the TABOR cap. That doesn't mean that we don't need those dollars above the TABOR cap, which in some years there's excess dollars that get refunded to people, that we don't need those to pay for things like education. That if we were to increase the number of seniors who could take an advantage of the portability of that senior homestead exemption, that we need a way to pay for that, or else we are looking at cutting things. That is why we have not been able to properly fund education basically since the Great Recession in 2008. It's because we didn't have enough money, and that we know that, yeah, sure, you could go ahead and take it out of the reserves, but reserves are one-time money. What you need for education is an ongoing, sustainable source of funding in order to pay for it. Because you don't just hire a teacher for 1 year, you hire teachers for ongoing years. And yes, we have made a commitment in our legislature to finally, since 2008, buy down what we call the negative factor, budget stabilization factor, BS factor, whatever you want to call it. So we will finally be in line with that level of funding that Amendment 23 said we should be at. But I want to also reiterate to you that this year's School Finance Act also put in that we want to have 2 studies in order to find out what does it cost to properly educate our children here in Colorado. Because if we go back to what Amendment 23 said, which passed in the year 2000, that's going to take us back to 1986 levels of funding, adjusted for inflation. But who says that's the right amount of money? Who here thinks that we overfund our schools? We don't. Because even right now, we have some of, according to those numbers, worst in the nation, we have basically worst in the nation rates that we pay our teachers. So our teachers can't live in their communities. If we allow and pay for this 1% per year for the next decade, right? This is how we are paying for this amount to backfill the schools. I think one thing that I don't think I've heard mentioned here this morning is that once we paid for everything else in HH that it says we're supposed to pay for, that the rest of that money will go into the state education fund. The state education fund is actually in the state constitution, and there are prescribed uses for that money. We can't just go and spend it on a new TV set or something. We have to spend it on legitimate educational expenses. We're not just down there like spending money on stuff. But that said, again, I want to emphasize that when people talk about this TABOR surplus, yeah, there might be money that's above the TABOR cap. That doesn't mean that that money couldn't be better spent, and that is money that you're paying in taxes, to spend that money on things like education, the roads we drive on, all the things that we value have been underfunded, and there is no way to recover that funding without a vote of the people. So that is what we are asking you to do, to help us get to levels of funding so that we can pay for these things we value. I had one other really important point to make here, if I can remember what that was. Well, I don't remember off the top, but hopefully it'll come up in a question. But I do want to thank you all for taking the time to come here and become educated on HH, and really, if beyond this, happy to answer any other questions that anybody might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Representative. And now we are getting to the question and answer portion of our program. So what's going to happen is I'm going to hand my microphone off to Joe, and so he is going to roam the room, flag him down. If you have a question to ask, if you have then please flag him down. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, then please direct it to them. For the panelists, I ask that you make sure that folks all have an opportunity to answer who want to answer, but also so we can get as many questions in as possible. Don't overdo it. So as I pass the microphone off to Joe, I'm going to cue this up for whoever would like to address it first. But I want to know, what is at stake with Proposition HH? What happens if it fails? All right, and so whoever wants to do the battle royale for the microphone, please take it away.
If Proposition HH fails, the property valuations will be based on really high levels of property valuation, which were when they were at their peak, right, back in June of 2022. So that's what your property valuations for your taxes will be paid on. We will also continue to have this problem that we have every single year in trying to figure out if we have enough money to make sustainable investments in education and other things we value in the state.
If Proposition HH fails, we passed a measure last year that still impacts property tax and the assessment ratio. So instead of your assessment ratio dropping down from 6.7695 down to 6.7, it will stay at 6.7695. So that little mini decrease. If Proposition HH fails, the Republicans in the legislature have continued to ask for a special session because, again, we could have taken care of this in session. There are 3 things that impact your property taxes: the value of your property, which is set by the market, the assessment ratio, which can be lowered without a vote, can be lowered by the legislature, or your mill levies, which can be lowered and floated by your local taxing entities. And yes, there are local taxing entities who know how to float the mill levy. They know how to float it down because I came from being a county commissioner in Weld County where we have 0 debt, and we have reduced our mill levy temporarily for the last 20 years by 7 mills. So there are all sorts of things that could happen. You don't need to give up your TABOR refund check. And with regard to education funding, the state education fund has $1.2 billion in it and another over billion, $1.4 billion that is set to come into that fund in the next fiscal year. There's plenty money for education because our legislature 2 years ago in 21 passed a bill that required school districts to increase their mill levies, not accept a tax credit any longer, and increase their mill levies. They increased your taxes throughout the state of Colorado by close to $300 million and growing.
Hi, my name is Wayne Gutowski. I live in Fort Collins. And I kind of chuckled hearing all these comments about money towards education. Let's face it, education is not a priority in the state of Colorado. I taught here for 20 years at Loveland High School in the Thompson School District, and if we got a raise, it had to come from our community. We got very little money from the state of Colorado. And I'm sitting here listening, oh, well, this money's going to go to education. My comments, I'll believe it when I see it. My daughter, 17 years, Wellington Elementary, busted her buns 7 o'clock in the morning, out the door, home at 6. She left. Carly, why'd you leave? Respect and money, Dad. So I keep on hearing education. I taught for 32, 12 in California, 20 here. Loveland High School, the greatest high school in the state of Colorado. And yet, there are times that we got no raise because the community would not increase property taxes. Teachers are bailing out. Excellent teachers are bailing out. And I point my finger to the state of Colorado, get off your butts and start funding education.
Thank you. And if we could just pose it in the form of a question.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I have a question that I'm hoping somebody on the panel will be able to help me with, and perhaps Barb, because you alluded to that. One of a group that I don't see here represented are the counties. And I was wondering if somebody could help me with that in terms of if it passes, if it fails, HH, what would be the impact on counties? Because I've heard that it's significant.
So again, property taxes are a function that happen at the local taxing entity. The state does not collect property taxes. We collect income taxes and sales tax. That's what we're based off of. So we have a legislature that's messing around with the counties and all of the other taxing entities. So cities, special districts like fire districts, water districts, sanitation districts, library districts, the list goes on. So the state is messing around with those taxes. And really, this is something that should be decided and is typically decided at the local level with regard to property taxes. Now we can, at the legislature, as I've said, address the assessment ratio, and we can reduce that. And what happened in 2020 with the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, which was a constitutional amendment, remember Governor Polis told everybody about a week before that election that if you don't vote to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, your property taxes are going to go up. They're going to go through the roof. Well, look what happened. People voted. We got rid of our safety net called Gallagher Amendment. If the Gallagher Amendment was still in place, local government taxing entities would be dealing with an assessment ratio of 4.9. And they would have been dealing with it. Or they could have gone to their voters and said, hey, We need more money to do roads, to do fire services, to do whichever, whatever the taxing entity does, water, sewer, all of those things. They've had the ability to do that, and nearly every municipality, a huge majority of municipalities, I don't know the number, have debruced, so they can go above the limits and go above the TABOR limits and keep collecting revenues. They can go back to their voters and ask that. So they can go and deal with that themselves. I do know in talking with a lot of county commissioners throughout the state that they are working with all the taxing entities within their county to see if they couldn't provide some property tax relief. Maybe everybody lower their mill levy some, not a lot, but temporarily lower it. And when I say temporarily, you can lower it down temporarily and then you can increase it back up. If you lower it down permanently, you can't increase it back up without a vote of the people. So I know that they are working on that. They understand the bind that property tax owners are in because they see them. There are appeals that they have received this year. Counties are the Board of Assessment Appeals. They stand as that. They have seen those appeals. The numbers are through the roofs. It's just like I told you, my 93-year-old friend, been in her farm and her home for over 60 years. She protested her taxes, and they can go in and they can reduce the values to some extent, but they could also go in and they could float their mill levies down and deal with this property tax issue themselves. Or back to what Representative Lynch said, the governor could have actually worked with cities, with counties, with special districts, and said, hey, how can we work together to lower property taxes? He chose not to do that. This bill was introduced 7 days before the session was over. 7 days. It came out at 10:30 at night on a Monday night. It was in an appropriations committee I sit on at 10 o'clock the next day. An over 60-plus page bill and 25 pages in a fiscal note. I had no time to read that bill. The presentation from the two Senate sponsors lasted about 8 minutes. As far as public ability to comment, they didn't even have the bill to be able to comment on it. It was a very short public comment period. We had two individuals who spoke about this. One was from the education community. They were a lobbyist. The other one was the lobbyist or the executive director of special districts. So just so you understand, Special Districts Association is opposing HH. They want the state to get out of their property tax collection. That's their revenues. They will work with their communities and take care of things.
I was watching. I watched the whole. Can I respond, please?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Just on the other side to make sure that we're having a fair conversation here. So, again, when the people of Colorado repealed Gallagher, one of the reasons that it was repealed is it was putting a disproportionately high property taxes onto commercial folks. So, this is NCLA, you guys are a lot of small businesses, and that assessment rate there was at 29%. Now, HH is going to bring that down, I believe, about 5%. Where we were with the with residential assessment rates, which before Gallagher were up at least 24%, they have dropped down to around 7.15% when we repealed Gallagher. So we always said, yes, we need to repeal and replace Gallagher. This is that solution. So when it comes to your counties, what you're talking about is an average increase of about 40% in the property valuations. So the counties, well, yes, they're not going to get as much of that increase. They're going to still get a lot of increase in that. And there is some backfill available for those smaller counties and for the more emergency-focused districts, special districts. We don't want to leave people without those services they need. But we also don't want people to be squeezed out of their homes and left with high property taxes that they can't pay. Yes, the property taxes still increase, but it's less of an increase. So what we tried to do here was make it fair. Also, one of the things I don't think really got discussed here is that there's an increase in how much those mills can increase every year. The maximum amount of taxes, I think it's around 3%. But I also want to note that a local jurisdiction can, like say you're say you're in a district and you have an expense that you need to cover, you can have a public meeting and that publicly elected board can override those limits. So that's what could happen as this goes into the future, because we don't want to leave people without that local control.
I was watching this be discussed in the Senate, and I'm still trying to learn, but everybody was going over the bill, and then someone put forth an amendment that said, why don't we just be honest on the ballot what this is for the voters? And I thought, oh, good, it's going to be fine, and everyone voted it down. And so I'm curious. I hear that we want transparency, and I hear that everybody wants what's for the people, but I am curious, just as learning about this process, why would the legislators vote down transparent ballot language?
Sure. I'd love to. It was probably one of my amendments or somebody, but I cannot tell you why the Democrats voted down my amendment. They voted down several amendments that I had, several amendments to make the bill either more transparent or more fair, and the list just kept going. So I got maybe a couple amendments on, but quite frankly, it was very clear that they didn't want to discuss the bill on the floor. So remember, we talked about process. First of all, very limited public hearing process. I mean, 2 people in the public hearing a day after the bill's introduced. It comes out on the internet at 10:30 at night. It gets introduced at 9 o'clock, literally on the floor, gets sent to a committee, 10 o'clock. Some of the other bills, the one that Representative Lynch spoke about, the companion bill 1311, House Bill 1311, when it got introduced, we were hearing it on a Saturday morning, and the internet went out. So you couldn't even remote in. So I have no clue why the senators, other than they just really didn't want to talk about it, and they don't really want you to know what's in this bill, and they don't want you to be transparent about it, because it's very clear. Even with regard to the local government reimbursement that's been spoken about here, that local governments are going to get reimbursed. No, probably not going to happen. Having been a county commissioner for 20 years, I actually understand how property taxes work and what's going to happen here. I asked for an amendment to change that base year from January 1, 2022 to rotate every 2 years, like with our reappraisals, every 2 years, because there's another provision in this bill. Again, it's like a big secret. Nobody wanted to talk about it until I brought it up. There's another provision in this bill that if a local government taxing entities, if the county's assessed value increases by 20%, no reimbursement. So no reimbursement. They keep talking about how they want to make sure there's provision for services, for fire districts and things of that nature. I just want you to understand. They put in the bill a provision that says if the counties, so overall counties, and there is this complicated formula in the bill about all other local government entities, how they get reimbursed, and it's based on counties' assessed valuation. So if the county's assessed valuation increases by more than 20%, no reimbursement. That's what they put in that bill. So, and then Representative Kipp talked about the cap for local governments. We put a cap. Legislators put a cap on what our property taxes, on what local government revenues could be. We truly just started messing around in someone else's revenues, some other government's revenue. We put a cap on it, and at the same time we said, give us your refund check, folks, because we want to grow state government. That's outrageous to me. If I was the county commissioner, I'd been down there yelling and screaming at everybody. I was just doing it as a state senator.
And that cap can be overridden, as I just stated. And regarding the amendments, you know, amendments, people bring them down to the floor. They say what's in them. There are often other things that are in them, so I can't speak to whatever particular one you were looking at. There are reasons people take the votes they vote, and I think in general, we all want our government to be fair and transparent. Now that this is going to be in the Blue Book, you can go and you can read the whole thing for yourself, see exactly what's in it, so there should be no lack of transparency going forward in this.
And I just want to point out as well.
Would you like a microphone?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If the local government votes, and it's the body, it's the board, like the Board of County Commissioners or the board for the special district or the fire district, whichever it is, if they vote to go over the cap, again, no reimbursement for them. So that's what the legislature did. They went in, capped, told local governments, you're going to have to take a cut, and in the meantime, us at the state, we're getting your refund check, we're getting their refund check, and we're going to go grow state government by over $10 billion at least over the next 10 years. Great idea.
I'm Tom Norton, and I was in the state legislature amongst a number of other political jobs over my career. One of the things that really bothers me, and having managed the last few days of a session and knowing what can happen and what can be introduced, for a bill of this complication, I'm very concerned about the fact that it didn't have open debate at the introduction. That's where, to me, the transparency should be. It isn't after the fact. When you have transparency, you have transparency at the beginning, not when it goes through committee in 3 days and that sort of stuff. And I caught my fair share of hell when we introduced a bill and I approved it, and it went through in those 3 days. And so I know it's possible, but generally speaking, it was a subject that had its transparency by discussion in a lot of different areas. So that then becomes my question. Is there anybody on this panel who is willing to take this back to the legislature and have the transparency discussion that we're having right now at the legislative process to bring forward something that really fits all of these various capacities that everybody's trying to put into this bill? It seems to me that having put together a bill that is a little bit good for everybody is also pretty bad for everybody, and a more definitive bill could be put together. And if it doesn't pass, can you or will you go back to the legislature and bring something forward that makes some sense and actually, there are a lot of things you can do that doesn't have to go to the vote of the people. So what are those, and what are you willing to do in that capacity?
Well, Ms. Norton, thank you for your service down there. You've spent a heck of a lot of time in that building, a lot more than I ever desire to be honest. We actually did that. We had a bill, House Bill 1054, that said, hey, let's take some time. Let's actually, devote some real effort into doing this. So we've made that attempt, and I think everybody up here would be all for that. I do want to add one more thing about that last minute House Bill 1311. That only went through appropriations. That had no hearing, by the way. And you know how long they spend talking about bills and appropriations, but just thought I'd add that in there. But I think everyone at this table would be willing to have that conversation and involve the people around the state, and not just what we think is probably best coming out of Denver. So.
And thank you for that question. I would love to be able to bring this issue back. I would love this ballot initiative to be voted down. It did not get its fair time. You heard about the two people who actually testified in an appropriations committee. We have a 120-day session, and it ought to make you very suspicious when something this complex comes in, at least into the Senate at day 117, and they want to get it in without anybody noticing. A complex bill like this, and we've got a lot of new people in the legislature that I wonder how many read it to really understand it, because I, in all honesty, I don't know if they would agree with everything that's in this bill. But I would love this concept to come back. I would welcome a special session. And I would like it to come back in the first month we go January to May, but it comes up in the last 3 days. Why couldn't it have come in February? We're not doing a whole lot in the first month, I'll tell you that. There's not a whole lot of bills coming through committee. And if this is so important, and we've got so many questions and concerns on both sides, well, I know in opposition, but I think there's a lot of discussion to be had here, and maybe we can come to some middle ground. But I would be very happy if we could bring back this concept, I guess, and we can pass the portability law. We've tried it twice. We can do other things in the legislature where we don't need Proposition HH.
Thank you, Tom, for your service and for the great question. I continue to beat this drum, and I will as long as the voters have given me the privilege to serve, and that is 120 days of session. I intend to spend every 120 days of that session doing the people's work. And if that means that a bill that has an appropriation needs to come forward after the long bill, which if you look at our legislative calendar, you understand why a lot of bills move the last couple of weeks of legislative session. Because anything with a spend that is not de minimis in nature, this year is about $300,000, typically gets held until after the long bill is passed and we actually know how much money we have as a state. I think that's a very fiscally responsible way to govern and legislate. I'm also not skeptical when I see a late bill, because I know that I have the ability to read through that bill and vote as people in my district are asking me to. And it doesn't matter if it's 11:59 p.m. on the last day of session and I'm pushing that button, or if it's the first day of session I'm given the privilege to push that button. I read the bills, I ask folks about questions in my district, and then I vote accordingly. So I understand frustrations with the process. However, the bill did get hearings in committee. I was on one of those committees. The public was given the opportunity to comment. They can do that. Even past public comment in a committee, we have second reading and third reading of the bill. It went on for some time on the House floor. So I think process is critical. It's also important to note, does anybody know how we call a special session? Tom, I know you do, you're a spoiler. Yeah, Steve, great. Who calls a special session, or what does it take in each chamber? 2/3 vote in each chamber, or the governor can call a special session. Now, the governor can call a special session and the legislature can summarily dismiss that and basically vote to adjourn, right? So there's a number of stops in front of that. If the governor chooses to call a special session, I'm sure we will all be there. However, I would like to ask another question. If it has to do with taxes, who wants to vote on that? Do you want to vote on that? If it has to do with tax increases, do you want to vote on that? If it has to do with property taxes, do you want to vote on that? To solve this statutorily without asking the voters seems like a stretch too far for me. Now, I encourage you to vote your conscience and to vote based on the good information you have in front of you. But that is a decision that I think is best left with you, which is why, again, I believe HH, not only an approach in terms of policy, but also how we're doing that by putting in front of the voters is the right move.
So it's never a stretch to say you should go to voters if you want to cut taxes. Voters would be very happy to see the legislature cut their taxes without their permission. And in fact, the organization I work for, Advance Colorado, we already have a measure set to be on the 2024 ballot. We actually set a record, historical record in Colorado, collecting over 225,000 signatures statewide in every Senate district, because it's a constitutional amendment, in 57 days. That would cap an increase in property taxes in the future at a 4% annual cap. Voters across the state love this measure. We were literally having people outside of grocery stores, you know how people are outside of grocery stores and they're asked to sign something, they're like, leave me alone. As soon as they heard the word property tax cap, they were coming back and saying, I want to sign that. People of all parties, people of all walks of life, this measure is going to be on the ballot in 2024, and it will, if the legislature doesn't think a 4% cap is the solution, they need to act next session. And we've been saying that they should call a special session. I would hope that representatives and senators from the Democrat Party are pushing on their governor to call a special session. We've been pushing on him. We want him to do it. People need a solution. And the legislature absolutely can cut and cap property taxes without our permission. If they're not going to do it, the people can do it on the ballot in 2024, and that's what we're going to do.
And if the people do that without a pay for, you're going to see cuts in your schools and other vital services in Colorado.
Hi there, Sean Dougherty. I'm a local realtor and volunteer. I want to thank you all for being here today. You've had some great comments. Not being a politician, I should be able to make this quick. I just have a comment and a question. A comment on the property tax piece at a local basis. I know from the counties that I serve, the majority of those mills are for school districts, either a bond or for the district. For my house, it's 53.3% of the total taxes that I pay for property. So I wanted to make that comment to Ms. Gutowski. As for my question, the portability of property tax exemption for those 65 and older who've been in their home for more than 10 years, you guys have failed that the past few times it's come through. Why is it now a darling when you need it to pass something else? You guys could pass this. You should pass this. I understand the treasurers of Colorado were not in favor of it, but it makes sense for those who've lived in their home for a long time. Thank you.
And I'll just say very briefly, because we've touched on this before, that you have to pay for the things that are getting cut in other places. Otherwise, you're going to have deficits. Would you like to respond?
Thank you for that question, Sean. We did, like you said, try to bring this forward for 2 years in a row, and it was shot down. I can't tell you the excuse and the explanations I was getting from the Department of Revenue was that, well, they didn't know if they had enough revenue. And I didn't quite understand, and I don't even know if they wanted to explain it, but it was brought forth 2 years in a row, and a Democratic, I think it wasn't local government, it was a finance committee, PI'd the bill twice. But we can do it, and we'll bring it back next year.
Hi. First off, I wanted to say thank you. This has been very educational. I can see the benefits on both the arguments for and against Proposition HH. There are good arguments on both sides. My question is not in favor or opposed to HH, but is a question about the bill itself. As I understand it, HH has two major components. One is a reduction in property taxes across the board, and two is a change to the TABOR refund model, how the TABOR process works. Those are two separate, disconnected items. Doesn't our state constitution require that we have a ballot initiative having a single item covered as opposed to two? I apologize, I'm not a legislator and I don't talk really well. These are two different things, and I thought we would have, if HH passes, don't we have an almost immediate constitutional challenge to the state court system about the legality of HH, which is costly. Court cases cost the state a lot of money. Unnecessary court cases are unnecessary spends that could be used for other things. So that's my question, is how do we address that?
Well, first I'll just say it's already been to court, and the court ruled that we do qualify as a single subject, and these things go together, and apparently there's this agreement, so you can certainly take that away. Again, there's going to be different sides, but it's already been to court, and it's been ruled that it can be on the ballot this way.
So,
I just wanted to touch on that real quickly, because yes, it's been to court. The Supreme Court decided on the two issues question on standing. The court said they couldn't judge on that item because it hadn't been passed yet, not because they agreed that it was legal to be a change.
Yes, and thank you for your question. My organization I work for, Advanced Colorado, brought that lawsuit along with over a dozen counties, county commissioners, special districts across Colorado, because we all believed that Proposition HH is a constitutional violation when Colorado requires one single subject. This has 4 or 5 subjects in the bill, as we argued in court. And the court absolutely did not say that it is a single subject. In fact, the Colorado Supreme Court vacated the lower courts. The one judge at the lower court did say he believed it was a single subject. Colorado Supreme Court, a panel of the court, vacated that and said he was incorrect, and that in fact they could not consider whether or not it is a single subject or multiple subjects because they have to wait until and unless Proposition HH passes. But they said absolutely a lawsuit can be brought if it passes to challenge the single subject violation in HH. And yes, that costs a lot of money because our organization brought the lawsuit to begin with. It is costly. I think it's very unfortunate that the state is choosing to put something on the ballot that clearly violates our own Constitution, and if passed will likely be struck down because of that clear violation.
And I'll just, go ahead.
And I appreciate the question, thank you. I will say 2 things briefly. First, bills that are drafted are presumed to be constitutional thanks to our exceptional OLS and nonpartisan staff at the Capitol. The second being this, the second part of the lawsuit was struck down in terms of something that's come up here repeatedly about the language on the ballot measure itself. And the court rejected the argument that the ballot language was, and I'm going to paraphrase poorly, but they rejected the argument that the ballot language was either incomplete or misleading or confusing. And I think that's another important thing to keep in front of us as we have heard criticisms of how that ballot language is structured.
I just want to add something.
First of all, I just want to say there is this assumption that any legislation that is, any bill that is put forward is considered constitutional. That is by the legislative body. That is not by our staff. They don't make those decisions. So I was aghast when I became a state senator that I heard from the other senators on the floor that, well, it's constitutional because basically we've said so. So it's very clear to me in my 3 years, 3 sessions that I've been at the Capitol, that the legislature, the majority of the legislature, does not like to abide by the Constitution. They think everything they do is constitutional, and it's just not accurate.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Just going to ask, we're going to have to limit it to 2 more questions because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stephen Depperschmidt. I'm a mortgage lender here in town, and so I talk to a lot of people about their property taxes on a daily basis. And I'm actually a 5th-generation Lovelander. This is my first time attending something like this, so it's been super educational, and I've really appreciated hearing all you guys speak, and thank you so much for doing that. Upon doing some of my research before coming to here, I came across this 9 News article, and I just want to read a quick, brief section of it, and I'm curious to hear kind of some of your guys' feedback and comments on it. It says, if Proposition HH passes, school districts will get less money than projected from your property taxes, but that will be backfilled by the state, keeping some or all of your TABOR refund. If Proposition HH fails, school districts will get the same amount of money simply from your property taxes going up. Property tax relief is a property tax decrease. Your property tax will likely go up with or without HH. It's just a matter of how much.
That's correct. As we've stated earlier, and even Senator Fenberg, who is a sponsor on this bill, has stated this in forums that I've been in with him. Your property taxes are increasing. Whether it's with HH or we don't have HH, property taxes are going up. With HH, there will be a slight decrease in the increase. So I would just get you all, go to mypropertytaxco.com and figure it out for yourself. It goes right in there. You can figure out for yourself what it means, what your taxes would have been without HH, what your taxes would be with HH, what your taxes would have been with if the Gallagher Amendment was still in place. I mean, it's listed there and it spells it out very quick, very clearly for you. With regard to education funding in this state, and even within Proposition HH, school districts are exempt. So the property taxes that are collected from the school districts are still going to be the same. They will either, If HH passes, the state will have to backfill that and make sure that their property taxes are still the same that they're bringing in. If HH doesn't pass, then the property taxes are still coming in. They're exempt. They're purposely written out, and it's in the bill, it's in Proposition HH, that they are exempt. And the reason for that is very clear. With regard to school funding, and I'm going to round these numbers off, we fund about $9 billion into per pupil funding, base funding for schools. $9 billion. About $5 billion of that is from the state of Colorado general fund, from your income taxes and your sales taxes that you pay to the state. About $4 billion comes from school districts. In this last year, this last budget year, 23 session, the state reduced their amount going into the state education fund by approximately $160 million. And local governments, school districts, increased their portion, So the state decreased their share, local governments, school districts increased their share by about $635 million. You've heard them talk about the budget stabilization factor. That is the factor, it was called the negative factor, it's been called everything. It's certainly appropriately named when they call it the BS factor, because they shorten it up. Because it's BS what we have done for the last 13 years as a state. We have not followed or adhered to the Constitution. We have done a workaround on the Constitution. We go back in after the fact and we balance our budget on the backs of students and education. That has been occurring. This year, the governor came in with a budget request that said, let's buy down the budget stabilization factor of $321 million. You would have thought he would have said the whole $321 million, because that's essentially what the state government has been shortchanging education. That's what the most recent shortchanging was, $321 million. The governor came in and said, let's buy that down by $35 million, because I've got $635 million more projects that I'd like you to fund first. When we went to the legislature, it was still at that amount. It came in the School Finance Act to begin with, because that started in the Senate this year, to buy it down by $140 million. I was able, with an amendment in the Education Committee, to get that increase to $180 million. So we still shortchanged education by $140 million when we had $1.2 billion in our fund balance. We could have fully funded education. With regard to teacher pay, because I know that's been brought up here this morning, the state legislature does not determine teacher pay. That is determined by your administration and your school board. We don't have anything to do with that. So go talk to your school board.
I'll just say school finance is very complicated, and happy to have more of that conversation offline, just because, but yes, there's two parts to it. There's the property tax part that gets paid locally, and there's a per pupil amount, and the state backfills up to that per pupil amount for every student in the state. So that's what that article is saying.
Hi, Steve Urash, State Chairman for the new Colorado Center Party. The question is on Proposition 50, so for Kristi. We need some sort of a cap on the property taxes, so it's pretty obvious that Proposition 50 would be easy to get signatures for. We need some sort of a cap on the property taxes. But when you look at the Secretary of State's website, the Analyst staff had some very serious comments about how Proposition 50 would be implemented, and it looks like you would need to have the legislature figure out how to actually implement the cap with, mill levy change or assessment change. So there were very serious comments about that from the staff. And it also looks like you had two previous attempts at ballot language that tried to make it more complicated to protect agricultural land and some other things, and looked like you had sort of abandoned those because the Analyst staff comments were too complicated to make it work. So I wonder if you could answer some of those questions about how Proposition 50 would actually get implemented.
Sure, thank you for the question. Great question. So first of all, whenever you propose ballot initiatives in Colorado, if you've been a part of that process, you always propose multiple versions because the title board doesn't always set a good or accurate ballot title. And so you usually will try multiple versions to make sure you can get a ballot title that's really representative of the attempts that you're trying to do and the intent behind the measure. So that's really the only reason for multiple attempts at ballot language. It's not that the analyst's comments were problematic, actually. It's you just try multiple versions and see what works. And so as far as Initiative 50, basically the state already sets assessment rates. And so yes, Initiative 50 would allow them to set regional assessment rates to keep the entire increase in property taxes on an annual basis below a 4% cap. So it's 4% annually, 8% for every assessment cycle. But the other piece that you may not have seen in that documentation is that the 4% cap actually starts after this huge over 30% increase has happened. So for anyone saying that a 4% cap wouldn't actually give local governments the amount they need, that's completely false because they already, because the legislature didn't act, already are getting an over 30% increase in property taxes that they're able to use, and this 4% cap annually would hit after that. So there would already be this giant surplus in money that state and local governments are dealing with, and then it's a 4% cap on top of that. Yes, the state legislature will have to deal with assessment rates. That's something they already deal with, though. The other piece of Initiative 50 that I think is very important is that if the government ever says, hey, we actually need more money, we need more than your 4% cap, they can get it. They just have to go ask voters. Basically, Initiative 50 would be TABOR 2.0. Right now, to increase property taxes, you don't necessarily have to go to voters, but this would require that you do. If the government wants to take more than a 4% annual cap, they have to go ask voters. So make the case for it if you need it. So that's one of the reasons it was really popular too, is because people in Colorado want the ability to vote if their taxes are going to be increased, as opposed to right now, the over 30% hike in property taxes that they had zero say over and was just slammed on them, and then the legislature failed to fix it. So I'm happy to talk to you offline about more specific details, but that's an overview of Initiative 50.
All right, well, thank you very much. Hope you will join me in thanking all of our panelists for being here today. Unfortunately, the center wouldn't allow us to take this conversation through the evening because it sounds like that's kind of where we were headed. But I certainly hope that all of you will take full advantage now that you know names and faces. Please take full advantage of not only pigeonholing them on their way out, but certainly engage in this conversation with your colleagues, and feel free to use all of us as a resource for that conversation, because this is a very important topic. So once again, thank you all for taking the time and coming and doing this, and we look forward to seeing you at our next NOCO Housing Now event, which you are now on the mailing list. So thank you very much.
Oh, nice to meet you.